In the first week of April, the Hollis orchard should have been a wall of pink. 200 peach trees in bloom, so much blossom you couldn't see the branches. The kind of pink that stops cars on the county road. That was how it had looked every spring for 40 years. This April, the trees were bare. Not dead, bare. Grey wood against a grey sky. A few sad clusters of bloom near the tops of the tallest trees and nothing else. It was as if the whole orchard had overslept and couldn't figure out what season it was. Everyone in town had a theory. Old age. Bad pruning. The girl who'd come back to run it didn't know what she was doing. A curse, said one man at the feed store, only half joking. The Hollis place had lost its old man that winter, and grief does strange things to land. But the orchard wasn't cursed, and it wasn't dying of old age, and the trees hadn't forgotten how to bloom. Something much stranger and much simpler had happened, something you could measure with a cheap thermometer. And it was going to happen more and more. Almost nobody standing on that road looking at the bare trees understood it. The winter had been too warm, not too cold. Too warm, and a peach tree that doesn't get a cold enough winter will stand there in spring, alive and green-budded and utterly refusing to bloom. And here is the part that sounds like a riddle. The trees had never gone to sleep, so they didn't know it was time to wake up. This isn't a story about a secret buried in an orchard. There's no fortune in the trees. It's a story about a woman who inherited 200 beautiful, doomed peach trees and a notebook full of numbers. She had to figure out which one was actually the inheritance. Wren Hollis had not planned to grow peaches. She'd had an apartment 3 states away, and a job that paid fine and a life that was, if not exciting, at least hers. Then her grandfather Silas died in January, the way old farmers sometimes do, in the off-season, as if he'd waited until the trees didn't need him. And the orchard came to her, because there was no one else who wanted it, no one except her brother Dell, and Dell only wanted it gone. She'd grown up on that orchard in the summers. She knew the smell of it, the fuzz of a warm peach, the particular exhausted happiness of a good harvest. She did not, it turned out, know the first practical thing about running it. And she found this out the hard way in her very first spring, when the trees she'd come back to save stood in front of her and simply would not bloom. Dell had a realtor's number and a plan. The land was worth more cleared than planted, he said, and he wasn't wrong about the arithmetic. A couple of buildable acres near a growing county was worth real money, and 200 aging peach trees were worth, in his words, firewood and a tax headache. He'd say it at the kitchen table, kindly enough, because he wasn't cruel, just certain. Wren, the orchard's done. Look at it. Grandad kept it going on stubbornness, and now the stubbornness is in the ground with him. Sell your half. Take the money. Go home. She kept saying no, and she couldn't fully explain why, which made it worse, because no without a reason sounds like sentiment, and sentiment was exactly what Dell expected from her. The town expected it too. The girl playing farmer with her dead grandfather's trees. She could feel the story they'd already written about her, and the worst part was she couldn't yet prove it wrong, because the trees really were bare, and she really didn't know why. What she had, the only thing she had, was the notebook. Silas had kept it in the top drawer of a desk in the packing shed, a fat, water-stained ledger with a cracked spine, and every single day from October to February, for 40 years, he had written down numbers in it. Wren had found it going through his things and almost thrown it out, because at first glance it looked like the meaningless diary of an old man. Dates, and next to each date, a small number, and a running total at the bottom of each column. She didn't know yet that she was holding 4 decades of the single most important measurement in her grandfather's life, and the answer to why her trees wouldn't bloom. The numbers were hours, cold hours. Wren figured it out slowly, and then all at once, sitting on the packing shed floor with the notebook and her phone, reading about a thing called the chilling requirement while the bare trees stood outside the window. And once she understood it, she couldn't believe nobody had told her. Because it explained everything, and it was the opposite of what any reasonable person would guess. Here is the thing almost nobody outside of farming knows about fruit trees. A peach tree, an apple, a cherry, most of the fruit that grows on bare branches, doesn't just need warmth to make fruit. Before any of that, in the dead of winter, it needs cold, a specific amount of it. The tree spends the fall shutting itself down, going dormant, and it will not truly wake up in spring until it has banked a certain number of hours of cold weather. Not freezing, cold. Hours where the temperature sits between about 32 and 45 degrees. Growers call each of those a chill hour, and every kind of fruit tree needs its own number of them. Silas's peaches were mostly Albertus, a grand old Georgia variety, and Albertus are greedy for cold. They need something like 850 of those chill hours banked over the winter before they'll bloom properly. Silas had known that. That's what the notebook was. Every winter day for 40 years, he'd checked his thermometer and counted the cold hours and written down the running total, watching all season to see whether his trees were going to get what they needed. And here is the counterintuitive part, the part that makes people argue with you when you explain it. A warm winter is a disaster for a peach tree, not a mild inconvenience, a disaster. If the winter is too warm, the tree never banks enough cold, never completes its dormancy, and in spring it stands there confused, leafing out unevenly, blooming late and thin or not blooming at all. It isn't dead, it's just never been given the signal that winter is over, because as far as its own biology is concerned, winter never properly happened. Wren went back through the notebook to the last winter, the one Silas hadn't quite lived to finish counting. His neat colosms stopped in early January in his handwriting, and then continued in a shakier hand for a few weeks. A neighbor, maybe, or Silas himself getting weaker. And then stopped. But there was enough. She added up the hours he'd recorded and compared them to the 40 years above. A normal winter here banked around 1,000 chill hours. Silas's trees had thrived on that for decades. The winter that just passed had delivered a little over 400. 400 for trees that needed 850. It wasn't close. It wasn't a bad year to shake your head at. It was less than half of what the Albertas required, and there was nothing wrong with the trees at all. They were doing exactly what a peach tree does when it doesn't get its winter. They were refusing to bloom because they had never been allowed to sleep. There was one more cruel wrinkle, and Wren found it when she called the county extension office and got a horticulturist named Pilar Ocampo, who grew low-chill peaches 2 counties south and had spent her whole career watching this exact thing happen to people. Pilar told her the part that's almost too strange to believe. The deep cold doesn't even count. Those bitter nights in January when the thermometer drops into the teens and everyone says, well, at least the trees are getting their cold. That cold is too cold. A peach tree banks its chill hours in that mild band, roughly 32 to 45 degrees. Below freezing, the counting basically stops. So a winter can feel brutally cold to a person, can freeze your pipes and kill your battery, and still leave a peach tree starving for the gentle, boring, in-between cold it actually needs. People fight me on this one, Pilar said, not unkindly. They'll swear it was a cold winter, and it was, for them. It just wasn't the right kind of cold for the tree. That was the moment the orchard stopped being a mystery to Wren and became a problem. A real one with a shape and a cause, and, she was starting to suspect, no easy way out. If you're finding this strange and a little wonderful, the way Wren did on that shed floor, you're the kind of person this channel is for, wherever you're watching from, and I'd love to know your part of the world down in the comments. The fruit near you runs on this same hidden clock, and almost nobody notices it until a winter goes wrong. Wren did not give up gracefully. Nobody does. Before she accepted what the notebook was telling her, she tried to beat it, and this is the part of the story the tidy versions leave out, because it ends in failure, and the failure matters. Pilar had been honest with her from the first phone call, which Wren didn't fully appreciate until later. She never sold Wren a miracle. There are things you can try, she'd said. I'm going to tell you about them, and then I'm going to tell you they probably won't be enough, because I'd rather you hear that from me than learn it in July. There were, it turned out, a few tricks growers use in a low-chill year. You could leave more wood on the trees when you pruned. More buds meant that if only a fraction woke up, you'd still get something. And there were chemical sprays, dormancy-breaking compounds that could nudge a confused tree toward blooming, chemicals that worked best in the warm southern orchards where low chill was a way of life. Wren threw everything she had at it. She left the wood. She scraped together the money for the spray, which wasn't nothing, and she and a hired neighbor put it on in the cold pre-dawn on the day the label said to. She did it right. She did everything right, and she let herself believe, for a few weeks in spring, that she'd outsmarted the winter. She hadn't. The trees bloomed a little more than they would have, a thin scatter of pink where there'd been almost none, and then that was it. That was all they had. Pilar had warned her, gently and exactly, the sprays and the tricks can close a small gap. They can turn a slightly short winter into an okay crop. But 400 hours for a tree that needs 850 isn't a small gap. It's a canyon. There was, in Pilar's words, simply too much deficit to overcome, and no amount of doing everything right was going to change the fact that the cold the trees needed had never come. That summer, the Hollis orchard produced a fraction of a normal crop. Not zero, but close enough to zero that it broke Wren's heart to walk the rows, past 200 healthy green trees carrying almost no fruit. She'd done the work. She'd spent the money. She'd been right about wanting to save the place, and it hadn't mattered, because you cannot argue a peach tree out of the winter it didn't get. As Pilar put it, in the flattest, truest sentence anyone said to Wren that whole year. You can protect a crop from cold. You cannot make it cold when it's warm. That one's not up to us. Dell came by in July, saw the empty branches, and didn't gloat, which was almost worse. He just looked at it and said, I'm not trying to hurt you, but that's 2 seasons near enough. How many can you afford? And the terrible thing was that on the narrow question he was asking, are these particular trees going to keep paying? Dell was right. He had been right the whole time. The Elbertas in this climate, in these warming winters, were done, not because anyone failed them, because the winters they were built for weren't coming back reliably, and hope is not a chill hour. Here is where the story turns, and it doesn't turn the way you'd want it to. Wren did not find a way to save the Elbertas. There wasn't one. The turn is quieter and more honest than that. She stopped trying to win the old fight and started paying attention to what her grandfather had actually left her. Because the notebook wasn't a diary, it was data. 40 years of one man measuring every single winter exactly how much cold this exact patch of ground received. And when Wren finally sat down with Pilar and spread those 4 decades of columns across the packing shed table, Pilar went very quiet, and then said, Do you understand what this is? People pay for this. Nobody has this. 40 unbroken years of chill-hour data from one site. That's not a shoebox of an old man's numbers. That's a record. You could see it in the columns, once you knew to look. The 1,000-hour winters of Wren's childhood, thick and reliable. And then, across the decades, a slow, uneven, undeniable slide. More warm winters, more short years, the totals wobbling downward, the 400-hour catastrophe at the end, not a freak, but the far edge of a trend Silas had been quietly documenting his whole life without ever saying a word about it. He hadn't been counting to complain. He'd been counting because he was a grower, and a grower measures the thing that decides everything. And the thing that decided everything was slipping. Pilar helped her read what the record was telling her to do, and it was not heroic, it was humble. The Elbertas and their 850 greedy hours belonged to a climate that this ground no longer reliably had. But there were other peaches, newer varieties, bred low-chill on purpose, that needed 650 hours, or 500 or less. They wouldn't be the Alberta. Nothing tastes quite like an Alberta, and Wren would be lying if she said otherwise, and she doesn't. But they would bloom. They would fruit. They would match the winters that were actually coming, instead of the winters everyone wished were still here. So she made the decision that Dell had been demanding, and also the exact opposite of it. She didn't clear the land. But she did, over the next 2 years, take out most of the old Albertas, grieving each one a little, because her grandfather had planted them, and put in low-chill trees in their place. It was slow, and it cost money she barely had, and there was no triumphant morning where the whole orchard came roaring back. There was just a young, thin, unglamorous new orchard, a few rows at a time, planted to fit the world as it actually was. Dell never came around. That's worth saying plainly, because the tidy version of this story would give you a scene where he shows up at the fence, hat in hand, and admits he was wrong. He didn't, and he wasn't. Not entirely. He still thinks she should have sold. He may yet be proven right if the winters keep warming past what even the low-chill trees can take. That's an honest fear, not a villain's threat. They are cordial at holidays. They do not agree. Some family arguments don't resolve. They just get old, and you learn to set a table around them, and the money was not a fortune. Let that be clear too, because this is the part the treasure stories can never tell you. A small orchard is not a gold mine, and never was. Georgia's entire peach crop, the whole state's, is worth something like $50 million in a good year, and that's split among every grower in it. A single family orchard's harvest is measured in thousands of dollars, not millions, in the years it works at all. Wren's new low-chill trees, once they matured, brought in a modest, real, seasonal income, enough to keep the place, not enough to get rich, exactly the kind of number that never makes a thumbnail. The land Dell wanted to sell was worth more as lots. He wasn't wrong about that either. She kept it anyway, with her eyes open, knowing precisely what she was choosing and what it cost. The real inheritance turned out to be the notebook, not because it was worth money, though Pilar's University did, in the end, ask to copy those 40 years of data into a research record, which is its own quiet kind of immortality for a man who never once thought of himself as a scientist. The notebook was the inheritance because it was the thing that told the truth. Silas hadn't left Wren a fortune or a curse or a miracle. He'd left her 40 years of honest measurement, and honest measurement was the only thing that could have shown her which trees to grieve and which to plant. The next April, Wren stood in the same spot on the county road, where the whole thing had started, where the orchard had stood bare, and everyone had called it dead. It still wasn't a wall of pink. The low-chill trees were young, and young trees bloom shy, and half the rows were still bare ground waiting for next year's planting. It did not look like a triumph. It looked like a beginning, which is a different and harder and more honest thing. But on the young trees nearest the road, right where she was standing, there was blossom. Real blossom, pink and certain, on trees that had gotten exactly the winter they were built for, a modest 400 hours that was a catastrophe for an Alberta and just right for these. The trees had slept this time. And so this time they woke up. She had her grandfather's notebook in her jacket pocket. She'd taken to carrying it, and standing there, she did the thing he had done every winter day for 40 years. The thing that was the whole inheritance. She looked at the sky, and she started counting the cold.